afternoon. Good afternoon, dear participants. Welcome to the last, actually, FSR online debate for this year. We are going to discuss about electricity network investments and the regulatory framework, a very topical issue at the moment as the new commission starts settling down. As usual, we will have some introductory presentations, then a panel debate and some polls. And I would like to invite you, as usual, to contribute to the discussion by using the Q&A chat that you see underneath our speaking heads. In the last part of this debate, we will give space to some of these selected questions received through the chat. This said, I'm now going to give the floor to my colleague and Deputy Director of the Forest Bureau of Regulation, Alberto Potocznik, who is also the scientific organizer of today's debate. Enjoy the debate.
Thank you, Ilaria, and good afternoon from my side as well. Welcome to this debate. Indeed, the topic of today is electricity network investment and the regulatory forum. The background of this debate is clearly the massive investments which will be needed in electricity grids, both at transmission and distribution level. Already this decade, the Commission estimate will be several hundred billion euros, both for transmission and distribution. In fact, large part of this investment will have to at the distribution level, and therefore this is it's a new setting. In grids have been developed in the past and have been paid in the past, and investors were happy to invest in grids in the past. In fact, they were often considered as a very good investment opportunity for institutional investors, low risk and more or less assured returns. We're not sure whether the massive scale of the investment would still attract the same level of interest. Some of this investment will be anticipatory, which means that they will probably be exposed to higher risk. But then this is where the regulatory framework comes in. And what we will try to discuss today is clearly a short event, so we have no ambition of solving the issue or coming up to a definite conclusion about this, is whether the current regulatory framework is still adequate to provide investors with an attractive proposition, whether we need more, and what is the role of regulation in all this. So without further ado, I would like to now invite our two speakers in the opening part. We have Raphael Sauter, who is a team leader, electricity, infrastructure, and regional cooperation at DG ENER in European Commission, and then Mara Berzina, Secretary General of CR. So they will provide the policy and the regulatory perspective on these issues, after which, as Ilaria mentioned, there will be a panel debate. So Raphael, thank you for joining us, and please, the screen is yours for your introductory presentation on the policy perspective.
Thank you very much, Alberto and colleagues, for organizing this seminar on an extremely interesting topic. And I will now share my screen with the aim to, one second, to introduce the topic. I hope you can see my slides. Now full screen. If not, please shout. Indeed. Thank you very much. So what I've been asked is to provide the policy perspective to open this discussion, and I will focus on the EU action plan for grids and the wider policy perspective, which then hopefully helps to elaborate and then go into more details in the discussion also after the next speakers' interventions. So let me start with a little overview on the political context when it comes to grid investments. I will speak in a second in more detail on the grid action plan, which is one element of several steps we have seen recently in the policy level in terms of grid development. It has gained a lot of attention, first also on the council side in the EU with the trio presidency, the Spanish, the Belgian, and the Hungarian presidency, who made grids one of their priorities under their council presidencies. And one of the most tangible results was the council conclusion on grids under the Belgian presidency, which was published end of May, which covered several key topics which are also reflected in the grid action plan and on which I will elaborate in a second, including planning, financing, cost sharing, but also supply chains, just to mention a few. Then another very important element in the bigger picture is, of course, the Draghi report on competitiveness that was published earlier this year, where energy and grids infrastructure investments more specifically were very important, highlighting the importance of grids when it comes to interconnections, but also grids within member states as a key element, a key enabling condition to ensure a competitive economy, but at the same time pointing to the fact that the investments needed, someone has to pay for them, and therefore it has, of course, a very important competitiveness dimension. And this is exactly what we will discuss today. And then moving further left here on the slide, the mission letters for the new commission, which has just taken up its mandate now, beginning of December. The mission letter for the Commissioner for Energy, Commissioner Jorgensen, has also some very clear elements on infrastructure-related actions. It emphasizes the need to invest in clean energy/infrastructure. It also refers to the need to look at the legal framework for European grids, just to mention a few. So there are several angles that show the importance of grids, which has been gained over the recent months, years, if I can say, but also to remain an important topic under the new commission that has just started its mandate. And on the left-hand side, you see legislative changes, which also have happened in the previous commission's mandate, such as the revision of the electricity market design, where there are some important elements when it comes to grid investments, such as OPEX related investments and how they should be taken into account. So that's a bit the bigger picture, which brings me to my next slide, which is the framework for interconnections for trans-European networks, the so-called TEN-E framework, the framework for trans-European energy networks, where we identify every 2 years projects of common interest and now also projects of mutual interest as the key infrastructure projects of European added value. And currently we have 85 electricity projects on the list, including also offshore projects and project of mutual interest with third countries, and also for 5 smart electricity grid projects that combine transmission and distribution level projects. But then the importance of electricity grids, just a short summary, because I assume all in the call are very familiar with the relevance of grids. But on the transmission grid, just to highlight a few points, there is the ambition to integrate more than 300 gigawatt of offshore electricity by 2050, all of which needs to be connected to the grid and also onshore transported from the coastal region to the consumption centers inland. And there is industrial electrification as a very important element, and the cross-border connections that have been highlighted, as I mentioned earlier in the Draghi report, and the benefits that largely outweigh the costs as highlighted in ENTSO-E's TYNDP, 9 billion of benefits compared to 6 billion of investments. At the distribution level, Alberto mentioned it at the very beginning, most of the investments are expected at the distribution grids because of the integration of distributed renewables. By 2030 and beyond, we have the electrification of transport, but also other new demands such as heat pumps, which requires these huge investments. And the last slide on the importance of this, I mentioned some of them already. It's the increasing connection requests and the increasing connection queues we see in quite a few member states. We have an aging infrastructure in Europe, which requires modernization, not only expansion, but also modernization of the existing grid. And there are systemic changes ahead with the integration of new loads at the distribution level, the need for more flexibility, etc. And then we, as I think many of you have heard the number, the Commission assessment assumes that nearly 600 billion of investments will be needed in this decade alone, around 2/3 at the distribution level. Against this background, in November 2023, we have published the EU Grid Action Plan with 14 tailored actions grouped in 7 areas, if you like. These 7 areas you can see on that slide, and I will go into the different actions in each of these areas. But what I think is important to highlight here, and the action plan and the overview here shows that when we talk about grids and investment in grids, it's a rather complex area, and we need to look at the different elements, which means the planning side of things, how to optimize the planning, how to prioritize and optimize the actual projects, and then how to finance this in an optimized way, also in view of using in an optimized way the existing system, plus of course very important in the current context, the supply chains as one important element when it comes to costs for the grid modernization and expansion. So let me go into more detail into the 7 areas. The first one relates to network planning, where we use, in the context of the TEN-E framework I mentioned at the very beginning, we have so-called high-level groups for each of the regions in Europe, where we plan together to a certain extent, coordinate from a regional perspective infrastructure developments, and also monitor the projects of common interest and ensure their timely development, and also making sure that the relevant topics are discussed in this context. We have then also ongoing work to assess the actual funding needs for infrastructure and investments, and I will come back to this in a second. But then, of course, the core elements here when it comes to network planning is ENTSO-E's work on the 10-year network development plans and how this can be further improved. And the examples to mention here is, for example, the better integrated approach towards offshore and offshore. So how are the new offshore development plans fully reflected in the TYNDP products to make sure that, for example, the internal reinforcements needed for the integration of offshore are fully reflected. It also refers to better system integration across different energy vectors, the better consideration of hydrogen, for example, but also storage, flexibility, etc. And then at the distribution level, also very important, the planning at the distribution level, as I mentioned earlier, in view of the investment needs there. And here we had already a concrete product that was presented in summer this year at the Copenhagen Forum by the EU DSO entity. Good practices on distribution network development plans as a guidance support for distribution system operators. Then the second area are then the regulatory incentives to support investments in energy infrastructure. And here I would highlight two elements of the action plan, which is on the one hand, the Commission guidance on offshore cost sharing, which was also published in June this year for the Copenhagen Forum, which sets out an approach to, as we call it, collaborative investments frameworks for offshore energy projects, which deals with sea basin, CBA, etc., but also includes tools that can help to better share financing for offshore projects. And there are elements included there, which we can go into more detail in the discussion, to see a bit also from stakeholders what are the views on these suggestions. And the second element here is a Commission guidance that will be published early next year, which is on anticipatory investments. The work is ongoing. We had this year already 2 workshops with stakeholders, very good workshops, where we got extremely good feedback on good and best practices in member states. We also carried out a written survey where we got a very concrete feedback, which we will now assess and pick up in this Commission guidance to be published early next year. Then we have the third area of smart and efficient use of grids, where we have ENTSO-E and the EU DSO entity to work on ways to enhance grid capacity, also by providing a better overview on the available grid capacity based on common definitions and transparency tools. We have ENTSO-E and the EU DSO entity to work on ways to promote the uptake of innovative technologies, with a first report that has already been published. And the third element here is that ACER, in its upcoming tariff report, should also look into best practice on how to better reflect, for example, OPEX-related investments in regulatory practice, just to mention one element. And this is due to be published early next year, as I understand. On the financing side, I would like to highlight 2 elements. One is we in the Commission have, with relevant stakeholders and investors, dialogue where we specifically had discussions on how to ensure the sufficient attractiveness of the infrastructure area for investors. And we also look into how to use in a most optimal way the current MFF to support investments in grids. We have, of course, the Connecting Europe facility, which is the kind of dedicated instrument to support cross-border energy infrastructures, like the PCIs, PMIs I mentioned earlier. But there are, of course, other instruments that could be used for the financing specifically of distribution grids, such as the Cohesion Fund and the ERDF. Then the next element is the permitting and public acceptance, which remains a very important issue when it comes to accelerated implementation of infrastructure projects. And here there are elements in the emergency regulation, but also in the revised Renewable Energy Directive to help the acceleration of permitting for grids, which ultimately also has an impact on costs when it comes to the time it takes to build the infrastructure projects. And we also have established a dedicated platform with national competent authorities to share best practice and help authorities to apply the relevant available tools to the extent possible to help the acceleration on the ground. Then I would also like to mention as a very important element the supply chain dimension, which touches on the one hand on possibilities to have common specifications amongst technology providers, where ENTSO-E and EUDS entity together with the technology providers are working on, which can help to accelerate but also reduce costs amongst the suppliers, and then the issue of grid procurement plans, and lastly common technology requirements for connections. All of this is work in progress and should hopefully help the supply chain to reduce ideally the waiting times, but also ultimately the costs. In view of time, I should come to an end. Let me just summarize that all the actions which I've briefly outlined in my presentations are advancing quite well, thanks to the engagement of all relevant stakeholders, which I mentioned already in my presentation, but I would like to mention them again because they are critical in order to achieve the objectives ACER and the ENTSO-E, but also the EUDSO entity, just to mention the most visible ones. We are regularly monitoring progress together with the stakeholders. And the next important step is the Copenhagen Energy Infrastructure Forum that will take place, as always, in the second quarter of 2025, where we hope to basically report on the implementation of all the 14 actions. But then, of course, work will have to continue, as we all know. And the last point is, of course, as I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, the new Commission and the upcoming initiatives on competitiveness, on affordability of energy prices, where grids will have to play an important role. So I would like to stop here and hope that we can go into more details in our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raphael. Thanks a lot for a very interesting and comprehensive presentation to set out the policy perspective. Clear there are challenges both at transmission and distribution level. Maybe they're different. Maybe we have more experience in dealing with planning at transmission level with the TYNDP, etc., and the 10E regulation framework. I think we need to catch up also on the distribution level. So the next one, the next presenter in this opening part is Mara Belzina, as I mentioned, Secretary General of CR, so the perspective of regulators. Mara, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Alberto, for invitation and also for the introduction. I represent Council of European Energy Regulators, the voice of energy regulators, national regulatory authorities, or NRAs around Europe. And I would like to use this a little bit of time since the topic is very relevant. And we always believed so as regulators, not only over the past years and during the crisis, but we have been doing extensive study on the different regulatory regimes around Europe for more than 10 years on annual basis. And on the next slide, you can see a little bit of the statistics of a particular study that I want to introduce you today. So the report, which I'm going to talk about for the rest of my time that I have here with you, is a series of annual reports drafted by the CR, and it provides a general overview of the regulatory systems for both electricity and gas networks, and also for the transmission system operator level, as well as for distribution system operator level within the CR member countries. The report has been growing also in the pages, number of pages. I invite you to have a look at it. We will publish the new edition next year, January, regarding the year 2024. And it's already around 200 pages. We have a good coverage of European member states, but also Eastern Partnership countries and other countries around the European Union. And on the next slide, yes, I will talk a little bit about the structure of the report. There is some variation in the number and in the size of electricity and gas network operators across European countries, of course, partly because of how different individual European countries have developed in the past with the different histories. However, we believe that network operators are universally regarded as natural monopolies, requiring the regulation by NRAs, of course. And each country decides themselves on the type and structure of its regulatory system. We stress that it is not appropriate to compare individual systems directly. Therefore, examining the different systems does, however, make it possible to identify similarities between them. No one system is unique. That's what we have learned, and I think everyone is aware of that. Rather, each system makes use of a toolbox of regulatory instruments, reflecting the current state of thinking about regulation in a country. It is often the case that several regulatory systems employ the same tools or combination of them. However, such tools are used in accordance with their suitability in the national context, which is very different, again, from state to state. In the report that I'm referring to, no surprise, the major focus is placed on the calculation of classic and adequate rate of return, the determination of the regulatory asset base, and the depreciation of assets in different regulatory regimes. We do acknowledge that other factors may also influence the work of regulated network operators or the decisions of investors, also including, for example, the time required, as it was mentioned by the previous speaker, for permitting process or the overall stability of the implemented regime. Our study shows that different countries have different characteristics in their representative regulatory regimes, but there are also many parallels that between the regulatory regimes that can be identified, and that gives us an opportunity to learn from each other. And this is exactly what CR's daily business is, to exchanging the best practices, that the best case studies are shared between the member states as soon as possible for the benefit of consumers. For the method of asset valuation, the weighted average cost of capital is the preferred method by many NRAs, where the real weighted average cost of capital is used for the profitability calculations for re-evaluated assets, and the nominal WACC is used for calculating historical values of the assets. Regarding the regulatory asset base, or RAB, that can be comprised of several components, including fixed assets, working capital, or construction in progress as well. There is thus some variations amongst NRAs again. According to the survey data, almost all NRAs include fixed assets in the RAB. In contrast, however, with respect to working capital, more than half of NRAs do not include working capital in the regulatory asset base, or use a derived notion of that working capital depending on whether the electricity or gas system operator is considered. The construction in progress component gives the same results as working capital. Fewer than half of NRAs include assets under construction in the regulatory asset base. The regulatory asset base value is usually linked with the depreciation, depending on the different NRAs and their decisions. In gas and electricity regulation, mostly straight line depreciation is applied. The surveyed NRAs use different depreciation values, with the majority using the historical value in different variations still. The lifetime of the typical network asset ranges from 20 to 50 years, and the majority of NRAs use an individual depreciation ratio for each type of the asset. For a deeper analysis of the investment conditions, it would be useful to take a closer look at the other parameters such as cost per unit, share of capex, totex, or other considerations of total costs, which we also do in different studies of ours that I'm not going to get into more details today, but those are important. Regarding the incentive mechanisms, incentives are one of the central elements of the regulatory regimes, of course, in European countries, and very important now when we discuss the anticipatory investments. Instead of defining all the working processes of the regulated network operators, most regulatory regimes only constitute a certain framework that aims to give incentives to network operators in a certain direction. This technology-neutral approach serves resources at the NRAs and triggers creativity for innovative solutions and progress at the network operators. That is our belief, and we have seen in practice good examples. What we have learned at the electricity transmission system operator level, for instance, incentives that improve the interconnection between separate countries and enhance the quality of security of supply play an important role. At the distribution system level, however, there are some incentives established, especially for the installation of operation of smart grids and smart meters, along with the integration of renewable distributed generation, electric vehicles, and recharging. Furthermore, the enhancement of cost efficiency in operational cost and an enhancement of the security of supply are important implemented incentives as well. Some countries have also individual incentives established in their regulatory regimes. I will give you a couple of examples. Like in Austria, regulatory system also incentivizes the network stability and market liquidity. The Irish regulatory system implements a list of incentives, for example, for minimizing renewable dispatch down levels, recognizing the importance of collaboration across the operators' levels, TSO and DSO, and others. The Finnish regulatory system additionally implements incentives for innovative and flexibility on both operator levels, meaning the TSOs and DSOs. On the next slide, I want to touch upon a little bit of on our recent publication together with Acer this year on anticipatory investments and what we learned over a study. This is a different study that we did at the beginning of this year. Is that there was no real definition of the anticipatory investments in place. However, we usually understand the anticipatory investments with the characteristics of a long-term horizon, of course, and some part of uncertainty in there. And then defining of course, again, the task of the regulator, finding the balance between the investment needs and moderating on the consumers, on the others, moderating the network users, and impacts on the tariffs is the daily task of the regulators. And regulatory frameworks mitigates the system operators' risk of underutilized and or stranded investments. In general, for example, for any project, it may also encourage investments in these so-called anticipatory investments. For example, in Germany, there is a special depreciation that can also be used to depreciate, for instance, stranded assets, and residual risks are compensated by the market risk premiums within the inputted rate of return on the equity. Moreover, also regulatory measures which are increasing TSO, DSO liquidity. For example, in Austria and Belgium, the system operators are entitled for return already before projects are commissioned, or allowing additional revenues. For example, a markup on revenue caps in Austria and Denmark may also facilitate network investments, including those which are more anticipatory kind. And on my final slide, yes, just additionally on the anticipatory investments that several member states do look into this forward-looking approach that we also learned over the recent regulatory frameworks report, which I talked most of my time. And I invite you to have a look on that in January next year, the latest edition. It's very interesting, it's very long, and it has also Excel annexes with all the data. So happy reading. It's a lot, but there's a good summaries as well. And that's all from my side. And thank you for your attention now.
Thank you very much, Mara. Thanks a lot for presenting the diverse experience of the different national regulators, and thanks also for the work that CR has been doing in trying to share best practices. I think there is probably a lot to be learned for regulators from each other. So thanks a lot. And now we've completed the opening part, and now I pass the screen to Ilaria for moderating the panel discussion, which comes next. Ilaria.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Great introduction with the policy and regulatory perspective. So now we're going to have a panel discussion, and I'm very happy to introduce to you our three panelists. We are going to have Carmen Reitinger-Hubner-Ruck. She is the co-convener of the Economic Framework Working Group at ENTSO-E, the European Association of Network Transmission System Operators of Electricity. We will then have the consumer's perspective with Peter Kleiss, president of ETF Europe. And since we're talking about investments, it's obviously very important to have banking and finance taken into account in the discussion. We are very happy to have our Deputy Director of the Florence School of Banking and Finance, Pierre Schlosser. So I'm inviting each of the panelists to contribute with a 5-6 minutes intervention, and then of course you will have more chance to bring your input to debate after we will have run the polls, so you will be able to comment on further input coming from our participants. And by the way, let me remind our participants that you have the possibility to write questions for our panelists in the Q&A box that you see here. We have now 90 participants in the room, so looking forward to the debate later on. We start with Carmen, who has prepared a few slides.
Well, good afternoon. I try to share my screen. I hope it does work, and you hopefully will see my slides. I hope this is the case. Please flag me.
Not yet, Carmen. Well, no worries. We have a plan B, as you know, so if that doesn't work, we are happy to share that with you. Did we try once more? And okay, yes, something is working. Something is changing. Yes, we see it very well.
Okay. Well, the first step, I hope you do not count it off from my 5 minutes.
Sure.
So thank you very much for having me this afternoon. Thank you also for the very kind introduction. My name is Carmen Reitinger-Hubner-Ruck. It's a very long name. Today, I do represent ENTSO-E here. Usually I work for APG, as you can clearly see in my background here. And yeah, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to provide here some insight into the TSO world. Investments, of course, are a huge topic, as you might imagine. And for that, I have prepared 2 slides touching especially on this topic with the inputs I want to share here with you. You might be aware that during the summer after Copenhagen Forum, ENTSO-E published a paper. We still call it the financeability paper. Of course, it has a very long, very interesting title, but usually we say it's the financeability paper. And here we do highlight, we have a number for the TSO's investment plans, which come up to at least 800 billion euros until 2050. We did a recalculation using also ACER's unit investment cost report, which is available. And we saw that this number of at least 800 billion might be even a little bit underestimated. So we rather go higher up. And of course, also you mentioned that we do need to modernize the grids because we know from the International Energy Agency that the grids in Europe are rather old. So a huge investment volume, which we do see. And we also say in the financeability paper that the regulatory system of the TSOs need to be adapted so we can ensure those massive grid investments. And now I take you a little bit back where TSOs do come from. So if we look back, let's say the last 2 decades in TSOs' lives were basically very focused on cutting costs. So for the last 20 years, that was, let's say, a huge topic within TSOs, within NRAs. And another point which I also would like to bring back to your minds is that the risk-free rates were rather low in, well, Europe and the world, and they have been for quite a long time. So just consider in 2008, we had the Lehman Brothers bank breakdown and the implications afterwards. We had the quantitative easing, which started in 2015, which went on for TSOs. It felt like forever, sort of, implying really low risk-free rates for TSOs. And you are all aware, I mean, you're all the experts here, the risk-free rates, they run into the WACC, which is the base for the remuneration for the TSOs next to the WACC. So the key challenges, which we do see now with those really high-scale investments, which I think we, at least in my professional last 20 years, I stayed with APG, we never experienced this kind of investment volumes. And so in terms of regulatory frameworks, what we do need and what we feel as TSOs we do need is we need stable but forward-looking regulatory systems, frameworks, also providing some flexibility, because all the speakers before myself and also Mara pointed out, there is not one regulatory system that is exactly the same in 2 countries. So we still need to have some kind of flexibility represented in those regulatory frameworks. What is key there? Of course, you see the numbers, they are quite high. We have to finance that. So, and financing is about having debt and having equity. And so we need to be able to attract, and not only attract, we also need to also retain the investors which we currently have in order to provide us with the financial needs which we have. And of course, this is, let's say, is very often over the rate of return to be handled. What is also necessary in this term, I mean, we need as TSOs to maintain also an investment grade rating, which can also be ensured by the regulatory frameworks. So we are really lobbying for this to be considered. The regulatory framework should also provide us with the necessary cash flows. We should also not forget that TSOs, as you mentioned before, our assets are depreciated over a very long time, especially line projects go for 30, 40, 50 years even. So we are not only talking about that we need to finance those new investments, we also have a lot of investments from the past which also need to be financed. We did not finance them all the way. So still here, not to forget about those old investments. Then, of course, cost recovery is always an issue for TSOs, I have to say. And also, yeah, incentives to invest here. We look into, let's say, not only into the CapEx direction. Of course, you already mentioned assets under construction. You also mentioned that in Austria, we have this kind of system, and I think it is a very good system. But also in terms of OpEx, I think there is also some, let's say, still some improvement possible. Assets under construction are, I think, rather important to consider. If you look into a TSO's annual report and you look into the asset section, you see there are huge amounts under assets under construction. And if you have the knowledge that it takes TSOs partly, for example, in Austria, 3 years to erect a line and put it into operation once we are in the process that we can already erect this line. So you can imagine we have huge amounts of money in our annual, balance sheets that is only considered as under construction. And for TSOs, as you mentioned before, only about not even 50% of the NREs accommodate for this situation in already providing some financial power. So now coming to this, let's say, new topic, which comes through the EMDR, anticipatory investments. We just recently published a position paper on this topic. So I think since those slides are being shared, I mean, please feel free to have a look into this position paper. The position paper touches, first of all, we do provide a definition on what we see as anticipatory investments. We also provide some key principles which we would, invite the readers, the stakeholders to consider. And we also touch, well, the regulatory treatment. We give an indication on how we believe it should be treated. So for the anticipatory investments, just to give you a quick information on what we see as anticipatory investment, we say those are grid investments which reflect an expected future energy need and which need to be aligned with the long-term climate and energy policy goals. They do come, though, with a higher degree of uncertainty. And those anticipatory investments should be justified based on long-term scenarios. So taking really demand, supply, everything into account. I think that is one of the key principles where we do point out it is essential that really all the stakeholders involved in being it member states, being it NREs, TSOs, we really do need to come up to really commit ourselves that we do really work together on this, because as TSOs, we cannot really afford to redo plannings over and over again because policy targets might change or some stakeholder has some consideration. What TSOs, we need to provide the service we have in an efficient manner. And so it is, I would say, of utmost importance that we do really have the commitment of all the stakeholders. And then I think it also makes sense for TSOs to do, and let's say, a good planning for not only for us, but for the society. In this paper, I already mentioned before, we have here anticipated long-term system needs, which we need to consider.
I invite you to come to the room. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of regulatory frameworks, what we need is, we need some adaptations for some national frameworks. NDPs should look into the future. We see different TSOs have different length where they look into the future, 6, 10, or even more years. I think we need to do here a little bit to strengthen or to enlarge the period we look into. We think that those anticipatory investments should not be treated much different to the other investments. And that is, even though we mentioned there's a risk, but it has also some practical reasoning behind. And what I think is also very important, since there is uncertainty and a risk for TSOs, in case we see there is an underutilization, there should not be an exposed financial penalties for TSOs. So we see that a socialization of the risk should be provided. Sorry.
Thank you.
From my side. Thank you so much.
Well trained and concise. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Now, Peter.
You have the floor. Sorry, I'm a bit confused. Thanks, Ilaria, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the views of those who will probably have to pay for most of this. I'm a bit overwhelmed by the hundreds of billions I've heard flying around in the different presentations. Both figures are about the GDP of Belgium. Just to give you an idea of the impact of the cost. And I think we have to think about also the possibility or the need to make sure that the dream of the TSOs does not become the nightmare of the grid users. I must say that grid costs are relatively limited. I'm not saying they're not important, they're relatively limited in the cost electricity users pay nowadays, specifically transmission grid. Distribution grids can be much higher. Just to give you again the experience of Belgium, the grid tariffs of Elia, our TSO, will double on the 1st of January next, double times 2, and probably they will double again in 2028, which means that for industrial consumers and consumers in general, this is really becoming a very important factor. Just bear in mind, please, that what you're spending, TSOs, is what your users will have to pay. And I don't think the grid is there for the TSOs. The grid is there for the grid users, no? So let's think about their concerns too. This also, while industrial consumers probably are not causing the cost. Yes, we might have need for strengthening of existing connections because there will be electrification, but we are not planning to invest in the middle of the sea or very far away from existing logistical centers. So it's more the generation side that causes the extra costs. So let's look also on how we can pass through these costs to the different types of grid users. That's also a discussion I think we need to have. 3, it's, I think, very important to look at the technological choices we make. Yes, the extra costs are essentially caused by intermittent renewables being built far away from consumption sites, and this is really leading to huge investment needs. This is not the case for all technology. The impact of PV, rooftop PV, is going to be very different from offshore, for instance, connections, or of nuclear connections. So let's also bear in mind that not everything has to come from intermittent renewable sources in faraway areas of the continent. About transmission costs, well, we do see that part of the energy transition in generation is funded by public resources. We have now with the EMD directive a clear framework for CFDs, PPAs. So let's think about options of financing alternatively grid costs rather than putting everything into tariffs. This is going to be really devastating for industrial consumers who need to be competitive over the world. You could think of alternative financings, and PCI has already been mentioned. You could look at other possibilities to finance the energy transition as you do for generation, to apply that also to part of the grid costs. And you can also think of compensations or reduction schemes for industrial consumers, as is already the case in countries like France or Germany, where, for instance, baseload consumers are granted a reduction in transmission costs because they contribute to the grid stability in the middle of the summer when the load generally is low. The timing, I think this is also very important, and the need for anticipatory investments, as Carmen mentioned, is well. Generally, we see that planning generation requires 4 to 10 years of planning and permitting, etc. Grids, specifically high voltage grids, then we talk about 10 to 15 years even in some countries. So yeah, I think this is something we have to work on and find ways to avoid this anticipatory investments, because yeah, well, what you ask is very much, you say, well, we want to invest in grids where we don't know yet whether there will be a connection to, but we don't want to take the risk. It's society that has to take the risk. Again, if it's the grid users, then and it goes into the tariffs, that will increase costs again for grid users. So I think we have to find ways to better plan the investments and to avoid anticipatory investments if we can, because this is the risk of leading to a very high increase of costs. And then last but not least, that is also an experience from Belgium. We've seen that the DC connections today have increased enormously in price. There's very little competition in DC technology. There are only a few suppliers of that technology. I think that is also something that we have to look at to avoid that DC connections, specifically for offshore or interconnectors, are exploding, and the cost again is going to go into the tariffs. So bear in mind that besides TSOs, there are also grid users. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for reminding us, all of us. Point of view of the grid users is, of course, extremely important. But so is the one that now Pierre will share with us regarding investments and banking and banks financing the reason behind this investment. So, yeah, we look forward to hearing from you.
Yes, thank you very much, Hilaria. My name is indeed Pierre Schlosser. I'm a political economist and the deputy director of the Florence School of Banking and Finance, which is a sister program of the FSR. So although it's been some time I didn't delve into energy, I very much enjoyed the discussion, and I hope I will shed some helpful lights from a candid perspective of a political economist in banking and finance. So I want to say 4 things, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. First, I want to talk about electricity networks as a dynamic environment. I will go a bit into green finance, because clearly this is one of the potential use of new instruments that can be of added value for network operators. Then I'll say some words about indeed the scale aspect of it, which both on the investment side but on the type of actors that we need to mobilize. And if time allows, I'll go a bit into the political economy, but otherwise I can park this for, let's say, the Q&A. So, I mean, repeating things that we know to start, we know that network operators are renowned for their capacities to sustain, to provide first safe returns and stable returns over time. But they also have this capacity to provide and sustain higher leverage than other type of actors. That's one element that I think is something that we should bear in mind. The second one is also the huge volumes again that we're talking about and the dynamics of those volumes. So if you look at recent figures from JP Morgan, in Germany, the spending on the grid in 2023 was 13 billion. It's JP Morgan, so dollars, which will have to rise to over $30 billion in 2030 and 41 billion in 2040. So we're speaking about potentially exponential dynamics, and in any case, a change of order of magnitude of 2 to 3 times compared to current investment volume. So what this tells me personally is that the financing actors relied on so far will not be enough to do this transition. So the volumes are huge, but the type of actors we rely on will need also to change. Then, as we discussed in the past on financing investments, green finance is clearly an opportunity for network operators. It's a great way, on the one hand, to broaden the investor basis of many network operators by enlarging it also to institutional investors, but also broadening the geographic base of investors. And so what do we observe there on the market? And here I did great research. I could see that on the one hand, at transmission level, probably also driven by the new rules, the taxonomy, the green bonds, and new clarity on those rules. You can see that RTE came up with a great green bond issuance recently, ENBW also very recently, Elia at 800 million euros issuance was oversubscribed 5 times, which shows the investor appetite again. Now, at distribution level, that's quite interesting, and I think we'll go back to it in the Q&A. Enedis in France is considering one. Stadtwerke München also just issued 300 million of a green bond. So they show a certain market appetite, and the borrowing costs generally are quite low. But the question is about access to that type of funding. So will all network operators be able to access this financing solutions in the future? My take is that TSOs, because of their scale, are in a good position. But the bulk of it in investments, as we know, and as is recalled in the action plan, will be within national borders. So there we'll have to see also what the DSOs will be able to perform. And as we know, the DSO landscape is highly fragmented. We're talking about 2,560, I think, DSOs who will have a hard time to adapt to those exponential investment needs. And for that, I mean, frankly, I don't see the Commission doing much more from Brussels. Perhaps at the European level, the European Investment Bank could do a bit more. But I believe that we're in the hands in there of national energy regulators. Again, just to finish on this, scale will matter. I want to use an example. E.ON, that you know, issued recently a 1.5 billion green bonds, which at corporate level, so not with the grid company, to finance renewable energy efficiency and so-called clean transportation. They relied on the type of actor that others cannot rely on. So they relied for the legal advice, for the whole structuring, I believe, also on large banks, but also on a law firm like White & Case. Now, you cannot imagine that smaller actors can be given this access to capital markets through those type of financial intermediaries, which are extremely costly. So it is something that I think has to be part of the equation of what type of actors, financing actors can DSOs especially, but also TSOs access throughout. And do we have an imbalance in there? Is that a problem? Is the scale, again, something that is going to lead to lower investments? Because here we're talking about a situation that also small and medium-sized enterprises typically also face. They cannot access, they have access to loans, they don't necessarily have access to capital markets. And that's a connection also with, I think, other agendas at the European level, which I think are really pushed heavily, will be pushed heavily in the new Commission, the Capital Markets Union, because it could be a link that could benefit in the end the energy sector. I will stop here, will not go into the political economy, but the bottom line there is just to say that clearly if tariffs are increasing, this will be something that will lead to new tensions, also as to the type of distribution that we're going to have in terms of the increase of these tariffs across consumers and hence also the electorate. And we all remember the Gilets jaunes stories. I think that on that we're just at the beginning. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks to you, Pierre, and also many thanks to Carmen and Peter for their contribution to this panel debate. We are going to run now some polls to involve also the opinion of our participants. So I'm giving back the screen to Albert.
Thank you very much, Ilaria, and thank you to all the speakers so far. Yes, indeed, we have 3 polls, and Tomiris, I've seen that she has already put one up. But the first one is on anticipatory investment, and what we are trying to gather from the audience, from you, is whether you consider the current regulatory framework adequate for planning and promoting anticipatory investments. And you can choose yes, yes, it's fully adequate. Yes, but more targeted measures are needed, or you can think that it requires a major overhaul, or you may have no views about this. So please share your views. Another few seconds. Okay, so I think at best it needs some improvements, but there is also quite a significant share of respondents that think that it needs to be changed substantially. Thank you very much. We'll have our panelists who comment on this later on. The second one is about the scale, and I think it links to Pierre's comments a moment ago. Considering magnitude of the required infrastructure investment in the years to come, do you think that the private investors will continue to be attracted to the energy infrastructure sector as the current regulatory regime provides a low-risk environment? This is what has been the case until now. Yes, they will continue to invest, but only if more incentives are provided. Or do we think that they will be either scared by the risk or in any case won't be sufficient to cover the needed investment? As always, you can also say that you don't have views. So yes, but, and no, it won't be now. Right, okay, here I think we take a more positive stance on this. Yes, there is money out there which might be going into the energy infrastructure sector, but clearly probably we need to improve the incentives. So thank you very much. The third one and last one, and here we are looking at whether beyond the infrastructure investment, we know that we need to smartening the grids, and this might not only require infrastructure investment, but also technologies, grid enhancing technologies. And then the question is whether you think that the current regulatory framework is adequate to promote a balanced approach to network investment and smartening. Yes. Not fully, as the existing regulatory framework is still biased toward network investments or hardware rather than maybe software. No, and you think that it's not a matter of incentives, but some smartening of the network needs to be mandated, or you can say that you don't want to take position on this. Okay, so here we think there is a slight majority saying that the existing regulatory framework is still biased toward network investment, but there is also a sizable proportion that thinks that smartening should be mandated. So here now we have the opportunity to ask our panelists and presenters to comment on this, and I would go in reverse order and would ask you to be very brief because we would like to give everybody a chance to comment, and we're slightly late on our schedule. So Pierre, do you want to start? How are you taking this, especially the question on whether investors are still interested in investing in the sector? It seems that the audience has quite a positive view.
Yes, but I think they were also saying that further incentives would be required. And I think that this is valid both should be valid at the level of investors and should be valid also at the level of the sovereigns, because clearly one question I have is about, for example, the stability and growth pact rules. Will network investments be exempted? I mean, there is a new SGP. I should know about it, but I didn't have the chance to read and get into it. So the stability and growth pact has been revised and provides for some exemptions for certain types of expenses, including defense, I believe, and environment. And so a question would be whether at national level, these type of expenses could be excluded from basically the expenditures reporting. That's, I think, at the sovereign level. At the retail investor level too, we should think of perhaps also reviewing also the rules on the tax exemptions, etc. And I was mentioning earlier the Capital Markets Union. The type of investment that we're talking about, which is low risk and rather low return, fits very well with preferences of retail, almost everyday persons. And the objective of the Capital Markets Union is precisely to say, well, we want to ensure that we don't rely too much on banks, and that we want to activate and fuel further demands on capital markets. And so that, I think, I see a fit that is interesting, that perhaps hasn't been so far exploited enough in policy circles.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Peter, what do you take from the feedback on the polls?
Yeah, thank you, Alberto. Very briefly, on the first one, current regulatory framework, I already said I think we have to work on speeding up the process of planning and permitting in order to avoid that building a connection takes longer than building the generation. So maybe we should go to some kind of a broader framework within which investments can be done, and where you ask a green light from the population or those who can oppose to new lines to plan this much more in beforehand. Maybe we should also review the monopolies. I mean, we already have some merchant lines that are being built. I think the general service of transmission and distribution should remain a natural monopoly, but maybe in point-to-point connections, we could introduce some competition in order to have a pressure from competition to build merchant lines. I haven't thought about it really, but it's worth considering, I think. And then on the financing, I think there we have to move away from the idea that everything has to go into tariffs. This is not going to be bearable for not for industrial consumers at least, and maybe also for households if you take on board the distribution costs. Look for alternatives to finance this infrastructure part of the energy transition. On the hunger of private investors, I think a lot of that will depend on the de-risking that you can do. And of course, if you have a reasonable return from an investment where you take virtually no risk because everything is regulated, then the appetite will remain. That is clear. So, and then smartening, yeah, of course we need to smarten. And if it doesn't work with the TSOs today, then we have to clearly give a mandate. By the way, I do see that a lot of new applications pop up that allow flexibility into the system, that allow smart use of appliances, of grids. And if the TSOs don't do it within a regulated framework, then probably the private sector will take it over, and the Googles, what do I know of this world, will come with apps that allow you to be flexible and use the grid more smartly. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks a lot. Yes, I was also a bit surprised about the share of the audience. I think that sort of smartening should be mandated, but this is probably the debate for another day. Carmen, briefly, what you are taking out of the feedback from the audience?
Well, of course, I do understand that the topic with the infrastructure investments that we are focusing here on the private investments. But of course, I really do need to stress that for TSOs, we also we really are competing here for capital. And we should not only consider the private investors, which are of course interesting, I would say, but we also really need to face here a little bit the equity issue, because we are in competition for capital at this point. And we need to increase especially our equity shares very, let's say, on a very quick pace. As for Peter, you're not a friend of TSOs, as I do figure from the wordings I hear, the dreams of TSOs, and we are not being smart and providing flexible options. I'm quite astonished about these statements, I really have to say. Here, I need to point out in terms of, cost of TSOs, as we mentioned before, we are depreciating on very long periods. So I do not totally understand why you would see that it would not be for people affordable anymore to pay the TSO, who is obviously providing a very, let's say, very important service to not only you and myself, but for the society. So we need to consider the electrification needs to take place. So we have the cost, but now we also need the quantities that people do really consume this electricity so that we can keep the tariffs low. And also one good hint I would give everyone to consider, have a look, what is the cost of the TSO, of the DSO. If you look into your bill, you might be surprised that it is not as you might expect here. Apart from that, going to the very last question here, yeah, we do see also that, of course, those smart solutions which TSOs already work on, being it flexibility, using KI or artificial intelligence, this is already implied, but we do see, of course, we would also like to get here some acknowledgement through the regulatory systems, for example, with incentives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carmen, for your comments. Mara, it seems that the majority of the audience is looking for some sort of enhancement of the regulatory framework to make sure that both anticipatory investment and the large scale of investment which is needed in general are actually properly covered and financed. I guess this is what CR is trying to do, but how do you take the feedback that you got from what is not, I mean, clearly a necessarily representative sample, but what's your take?
Yes, thank you. I think the poll gave a pretty kind of good result, that it's not too bad, not too good, and I think we are always on the way to improve. As it was mentioned by the TSOs over the presentations, that they are looking for stability but dynamics as well. Indeed, we are also looking for stability, predictability in our regulatory frameworks, and we do realize the really dynamic changes that are happening and needs, etc., for the investments. But again, I want to emphasize that I think that regulatory frameworks are there and fit for the purpose, and they do recognize the anticipatory investments with a bit of different incentives across European member states. And again, we are trying to learn as quick as possible from the better examples to bring them across Europe. But I don't see any revolution here. It's a minor. I would say it's a fine tuning to the regulatory frameworks which regulators are doing on a daily basis. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mara and Raphael. Finally, are you surprised by the feedback from the audience? What's your main take?
Well, I think what on the anticipatory investment, it confirms in a way what I presented earlier. And I think that the guidance document we're working on and the work we've initiated with the Grid Action Plan goes in the right direction to look into, and this is what Mara just said, looking what's happening at the moment on the ground, and to see what can be identified as good or best practice, and to help to drive this discussion forward. I think that's clear what I take from the poll. I think it's very encouraging to hear among the audience that the financing, that infrastructure remains more rather attractive, let's say, not to say that there are no challenges, as was explained by Carmen. But I mean, there further work needs to be done with the EIB. It was mentioned, for example, but also I think the national promotional banks and others could play a role here. But if I could maybe add one reaction to the previous speakers, and also what I think Peter mentioned it in a way, if I summarize it correctly, that we should not build grids for the sake of building grids. I think I think we all agree, and that we need to plan well against clearly established objectives. And I think the purpose of the grids is for the purpose of the users, both industry when it comes to competitiveness, but also for the consumer citizens to keep costs, prices affordable for everyone. And the one of the objectives is to allow the integration of lower cost generation capacity in the grid, and to keep up a flexible system. I think that should be very clear.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Thanks a lot to everybody. I think we still have a few minutes. Ilaria, do we have maybe one question?
Well, actually, as far as I can see, there are no questions in the chat box or in the Q&A session. You have your raised hand, Albert. I guess that's just a mistake. You click the button by mistake, of course. So no, I think we can have another round of quick final words, if you like.
Yep.
There seems to be no interventions here from the agreement.
Okay, so maybe 1 minute at most for everyone. So I will again start from the end because Rafael has just talked. So again, Pierre, do you want to have your final thoughts? But please stay within a minute.
Yes, of course. No, I find the discussion really interesting. Where I struggle a bit to follow the logic of the regulatory approach here is really in terms of we have really an exponential pipeline of investments, and what we're sort of discussing is how can we apply business as usual solutions to this, and that's where I think that there will be a problem further down the line. Not necessarily this year, not in 2 years. We have an aging network, as it was mentioned several times. There are a huge number of connections at different levels, but mostly also, of course, on the distribution side with different types of loads. There is a need to smarten the network at the same time. And at the same time, we're saying, well, the rules we have are actually fit for purpose. I have a hard time actually to believe that in 5 years, we're going to be able to say, yes, we were right. So I think it's always difficult to process all this, make sure we prepare also decision makers, especially politicians. But I think that someone should say, the transition has a cost. It would come further down the line, maybe not in your mandate, but we have to prepare for that. And I think that network tariffs, I didn't hear anyone telling me that they're going to go down in the future. So after this discussion, I still believe that. So happy, however, to be challenged again.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Peter, your 45 seconds.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alberto. I think I already said it. Industry believes the energy transition is necessary, and we have to do that. And it's a very important part of what we want to do in the next decade. But it's not the only thing. We also need to make sure that we can remain competitive, that we can maintain our operations in Europe. And this will require a fundamental rethinking of a certain number of things. How can we develop and finance correctly the grids? How can we change dramatically the way we generate electricity? And how can we make sure we decarbonize in a way that we can still have industrial activities on the continent? And that is going to be the subject of many more seminars and panel discussions in the coming years, I think. Thank you very much.
Indeed, Peter, and we will make our part on this. Carmen, your 45 seconds.
Well, I think as the discussion today shows, it is necessary that all the stakeholders do come together and discuss what is at stake, and that we really have, let's say, a very focused discussion. We do not pinpoint, for example, at one of the, let's say, stakeholders here, but that we do stay in contact, we discuss, we also use really facts and not just saying, okay, this is whatever. So for me, it is really great that we have the discussion. We have to keep it up, and I'm looking forward to do so in the next, I think months, years. So quite happy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mara. Your last 45.
Yes, thank you.
Seconds for this debate.
I think this was a very good and interesting debate with the different stakeholders, different representatives, where I think we did hear that the I think we still believe that the risks are well rewarded through the tarification schemes, and what I really want to emphasize maybe at the end of the conversation is affordability on the consumer side. That because as just it was said by the previous speaker, on the new investment needs, and they are huge, and we are here to the regulators are here to ensure this balance between the consumers and the investments on the grids. One thing that I didn't hear, maybe I missed it. Yes, there will be huge investment needs and maybe new approaches and ways of framing that are needed. But there is already some flexibility in the grids already that is not being utilized. I don't think we discussed this today. And the numbers of how much flexibility do we have in the existing grids are different, but this is something that we should take as a fast solution first, and then discuss of course, work all together effectively and do it the investments when they are needed, when everyone agrees, because we know the value of money. The €1 today is more valuable than €1 5 years after. So we don't those numbers that we saw today are different in different discussions, and they are increasing. I am learning every month. Thank you. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you, Mara and Raphael.
Well, just to add, I mean, this discussion will certainly continue on this topic, and I don't want to repeat what has been said, but maybe just one additional element. Maybe when we talk about network costs, we should take a system cost approach. So how can we reduce the overall system costs, and what role do network costs play? Even if they might further increase, they may contribute to reduce overall system costs, and this is what matters at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raphael. Just one piece of information before I leave the last word to Ilaria is that indeed this discussion will continue, and at the Florence School of Regulation we are already planning to hold one of our workshops, the one that are reserved to our donors, existing and hopefully future donors, on the 16th of May, and this workshop will be a full day, will be devoted to smartening the grid. So, that's the main challenge going forward. So thanks a lot to everybody from my side. And Ilaria, your last.
Yes, very interesting debate. I fully agree. And we can promise that it's not going to be the last one on this topic. Actually, the Draghi report and other publications are giving us a lot of input, a lot of thoughts. So we look forward to continuing the discussion with you, with all of you. Thanks very much to all our speakers and panelists for attending today, but also with the participants. And thank you very much, as always, to Alberto for being the scientific organizer of today's debate, and to our colleague Tomiri Samirova, who is behind the scenes, but she is really the one making sure that everything works and functions. So thanks a lot, and we wish you all good holidays, a Merry Christmas, and a good end of the year. So goodbye, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.